Hello, everyone. So my name is Pam Sari, and I direct the Purdue Asian American and Asian Resource and Cultural Center. So welcome all of you to our speaker series today. Today, Purdue ARC is collaborating with the Center on Religion in the Global East to discuss the topic of Christian nationalism, anti-Asian racism, and Asian American resistance, featuring our guest speaker, Dr. Russell Jung. So I would like to thank all of our attendees tonight for joining and continuing the conversation on how we can help address the heightened anti-Asian racism in this time. So almost 2 weeks ago, Purdue Division of Diversity and Inclusion and the ARC have issued a statement of support to Purdue Asian and Asian American communities, acknowledging that anti-Asian racism, including the shooting in Atlanta, have caused enormous fear and pain, sadness, and anger. So we're grieving and recognizing that all of these have profound impact on the well-being of our Purdue communities, especially in the middle of a global pandemic. So would like to thank and acknowledge Vice Provost John Gates in the audience tonight for his work. And thank you to many of you who have reached out to the ARC and reach out to members of Asian and Asian American communities that you know, organize open discussions for students, faculty, and staff. Just would like to thank all of you who are here tonight. So how tonight's event will go, Professor Jung will speak for about 40 minutes and then followed by opportunities to ask questions. So during the Q&A, you can ask questions by unmuting your speaker, or you can also send your questions on the chat to everyone, or you can send it anonymously to me, Pam Sari, on the chat. In case there is a significant Zoom issue or other element that will disrupt the event, we have prepared an email where you will be directed to an alternate Zoom link. So don't be afraid when that happens. We are prepared with an alternate Zoom link. As you are aware, this event is recorded and presentation will be made available on Purdue ARC and also CRGEU's website. I would like to also mention that Purdue Exponent is covering this event tonight. So Liana Bules, thank you so much for your work. I would like also to mention that live captioning is available. So I would like to thank Lori from Caption Associates LLC, and ASL interpretation is also available tonight, and would like to thank Lisa Melby from Luna Language Services. So right now I would like to thank again our collaborator, the Center on Religion in Global East. Thank you, Dr. Fenggang Yang and Dr. Chris White. This was originally actually a class event, and Purdue ARC has requested if we can invite everyone in the Purdue communities and even beyond to attend. So thank you so much for your willingness to do that. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Fenggang Yang, our collaborator for tonight. Fenggang Yang is a professor of sociology and the founding director of the Center on Religion in the Global East at Purdue University. He has previously served as the president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. His research focuses on the sociology of religion, religious change in China, and immigrant religion in the United States. He is the author of Chinese Christians in America, Conversion, Assimilation, and Adhesive Identities. Professor Fenggang Yang.
All right. Thank you, Pam, for this introduction. Pam Sari is the director, if you don't know, she's the director of the Asian and Asian American Resources and Culture Center at Purdue University, the ARC. And I really thank her and the center for the collaboration with us to bring this event to the broader Purdue community and beyond. As she said, this is actually part of my sociological class called Religion in America that I'm co-teaching with Dr. Chris White. We are so happy to have Dr. Russell Jung to do this guest lecture. Dr. Jung is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He is the author of several books, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, published in 2019 from Oxford University Press, and Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies. It was published in 2019. Uh, and then At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors, that was published in 2016. He has also published many articles on race and religion. Russell is a longtime friend of mine. Our interaction goes back to 2.5 decades ago. In March 2020, Dr. Jung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, which is a project and a website that tracks incidents of COVID-19 discrimination to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. Many media reports have cited this website, and Dr. Jung has appeared on many platforms lately. By now, actually, Stop AAPI Hate has become a movement even beyond the US borders. Uh, I'm really happy to have him to speak to us. Without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Russell Jung. Russell?
Thank you, Fangong. Thank you, Professor Young and the Center for Religion and the Global East. Thank you, Pam Sari and ARCS for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. White, for hosting this in the class. As Dr. Sari said, this is a moment of outrage and grief for the Asian American community. It's a real dark time because we're still grieving over with the families of the victims in Atlanta. We're also grieving over Colorado, and especially for me, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, seeing so many elders being pushed and shoved and hurt in the ways we've seen. So this is a serious time and a serious topic. And sadly, I haven't been surprised by the Atlanta shootings or the attacks on our elderly. Last year, we created Stop API Hate to track the racism, and we've received officially about 3,800 incidents. And if you've read the incidents, you would see how palpable the anger and fear is among Americans, how it's being directed towards Asians in the US at this moment, and how violent people have become. And so it is really hard for me to come at this moment in the midst of seeing so much graphic footage and having to reel from death to death. But to give you just a little sense of what we're seeing, I'm going to share with you some of the reports, and these are all senior citizens who are reporting. And as you hear the reports read by Dr. White and by Dr. Sari, I want you to feel what it's like to be that person who's reporting what's happening. And then later on, I invite you to put in the chat just a few words of how it makes you feel, just so that we can be present and understand what's happening at this moment. So I'll invite Dr. White and Dr. Sari to read some of these events that happened just this year.
Customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I am mostly Chinese and my family has been in San Luis Obispo since 1860s, or 170 years. I'm fourth generation in San Luis Obispo. Guess I will never be an American.
Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy.
I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with, "Shut up, you monkey. Fuck you, China man. Go back to China, bringing that Chinese virus over here."
On my daily walk in my hometown Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" When she passed me, I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings.
My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then said, "You need to go back to where you came from." We were shocked to hear this.
Waiting to enter pharmacy to get prescription, group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of the situation by mocking me, faking coughing, spitting, and made slant eye gesture till I told him to cut it out. No one else called this person out.
I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. The mother came up and put her hand on my arm. She didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977.
As I was leaving the restaurant, white male stormed up to me and verbally harassed and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you effing Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically. This went on for several minutes as I departed the scene quickly to call the police. A clear case of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to another officer who arrived later. I have not heard back from anyone.
Thanks. So go ahead and type in the chat how these incidents make you feel. So I see scared, nauseous, sad, angry, mad, sad, disgusted, very sad, angry, shocked, devastated, disgusted, afraid, can't stop crying, hopeless, sad, unacceptable, devastated, heartbroken, outraged, horrified, sick and angry, motivated to act, outraged, now desensitized, confused, saddened, shamed, frustrated, scared, isolated. Thanks. So I think the feelings of outrage and anger are valid because these are such heinous acts. And to give you a sense of what's happening nationally, I'll share a little bit about our data. Actually, I do want to take a moment of silence too, because it's been hard that I keep on talking about the Chinese person who died or the Thai person who passed away, but I think it's important for me to remember their names and to acknowledge them before going on. So join with me in a moment of silence. These are people with families, people like Pak Ho in Oakland, where I live. I just heard, volunteered at the local church food bank regularly. And he recently died from violence. So let's remember these people. We grieve for Pak Ho, the 75-year-old Chinese American who was robbed and killed in Oakland 2 weeks ago. We commemorate Juanito Falcon, the 74-year-old Filipino American who was punched and died 2 days later last month. We mourn for Vicha Ratnapakdi, the 84-year-old Thai American who was shoved, slammed, and killed in January. We lament over Christian Hall, the 19-year-old Chinese American who was shot 7 times by police last year in Pennsylvania. We commemorate Angelo Quinto, a 30-year-old Filipino-American who was killed by the police with a chokehold similar to George Floyd just last Christmas. And we grieve and mourn those who were shot in Georgia and in Colorado. Those in Georgia their families wish to keep their names private. So let's take a moment of silence, please. Thank you for joining me in honoring them. So in our reporting site, we're seeing that not all the incidents are hate crimes for which you could be arrested, but they constitute the range of racism. 8% make up civil rights violations, getting mistreated at the workplace. 7% are online, and this is probably, again, just a fraction of what's happening. Microaggressions constitute 70% verbal harassment and 20% shunning. But the verbal harassment isn't so micro. 1 out of 5 respondents to Stop AAPI Hate now demonstrate signs of racial trauma, elevated long-term symptoms of hypervigilance and avoidance. It's been pretty, as you heard, pretty horrific to experience what's happening. We're being coughed and spat upon so often that as we read the reports, we saw the trend and we actually created a separate coding category for it. My own wife was running and someone blocked her path and coughed in her face. People are treating us so subhumanly, so much like objects that they just feel like they could spit at our elders. And physical assaults now make up 11% of the cases. We're getting pushed and shoved. We're having bottles and rocks thrown at us. I've heard several cases of people trying to run over people with their cars. And so now we've had the recent shootings. People are attacking those whom they think are vulnerable. Women are harassed twice as much as men. Elderly and young people are disproportionately impacted. So you don't think of Asian American senior citizens going online and complaining about racism, but they are. You don't think that limited English-speaking immigrants would recognize racism, but they know mistreatment when they're experiencing it, so they're reporting to us. And to give you some of the context of what's happening, the whole backdrop for this racism is that it's not new. We knew from Asian American history that history would repeat itself and that the yellow peril fear, the concern that Asians would come with their hordes of people and threaten the West, but they'll come with their racialized, disease-ridden bodies to take over the West. That fear gets re-invoked time and time again, especially in the US, and that it would be done again with COVID-19. Some context. In the 19th century, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen to emanate from Chinatown, being specters of death. That from Chinatown came these diseases of death. This is in the 19th century. Politicians used Chinese to build their political base. They said Chinese must go in order to protect white workers. They said Chinese were unassimilable pagans, for those of you in the religion class. And so Chinese as heathen, pagans, those were all bases for the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. At the same time, not only was there legislation to exclude Asians, but we were met with terrible violence. There are 300 recorded cases of displacement of Chinese communities. These aren't just lynchings of individual, but mobs driving out entire communities. 300 different communities across the West Coast. My own family were based in Monterey. We had a fishing village of 200 people. In 1906, they were evicted. They wouldn't leave. So a fire burnt them all out. And then the area was fenced off so they couldn't return. My great-grandparents, who had lived in Monterey for 4 decades and made it their home, had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as a refuge from that violence. Similarly, in 1900, the bubonic plague came. Health officials discovered it in San Francisco Chinatown, so they quarantined the area, they roped it off, they allowed white people to leave, but they kept Chinese segregated to get the disease. In Honolulu and Santa Ana that year, the entire Chinatowns were burnt down, leaving thousands homeless. So you can see there's eerie parallels. A disease comes, Asians are blamed, Asians face violence, and Asians face racist policies. That continued on Angel Island Immigration Center, where health and disease were used to detain Asians longer, and if they were found to be medically unfit, they would get deported. So the parallels are that disease and health policies were used to control Asians. Because of disease, Chinese were excluded, quarantined, segregated, detained, and deported. Later on, both sides of my family, my mother's side and my father's side, faced family separation for long periods because of tuberculosis and that health issue. This exclusion of Chinese as not belonging, this concern that they're disease-ridden, really corresponds well with Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, as defined here, comes from a book by Andrew Whitehead and sociologist Samuel Perry, Taking America Back for God. And Christian nationalism is a cultural framework. It fuses Christianity, the church, with American civic life, so that it creates a vision of who is American and what America should be. This Christian nationalism, this vision for America operated in the 19th century and has, again, gone through different permutations, integrating both this nativist sense of America plus Christianity to exclude non-Christians, to exclude non-whites. And it's a real powerful sentiment held by, according to Perry and Whitehead, 4 out of 10 Americans. Christian nationalism, in terms of the nationalism of Christian nationalism, it really makes strong assumptions that America is for those born in America, those who are native, so that foreign-born people don't belong. It assumes a white supremacy, that this is a white nation, it's part of our heritage, and we should maintain that sense of purity and whiteness, actually, basically. It's also heteronormative and patriarchal, supporting male dominance and, again, heterosexuality. And they tend to be people who favor authoritarian control and the strength of the military. So again, these are all support a nationalist perspective of who our nation should be about, who belongs, what our heritage is, and how we need to proceed to the future. How we proceed to the future is really related to the Christian aspect of Christian nationalism. The Christian aspect of Christian nationalism is that God demands national allegiance. To be a good Christian means you should really honor God in the US, and the US should be honoring God. And it takes a very Old Testament approach to scriptures where we should fear God's wrath if we're unfaithful to God. That was the Old Testament commands, that you would Israel would be punished if we were disobedient. But at the same time, America would gain God's blessing if it follows God's commands and God's mandates. And in their thinking, God's mandate is that we should take over America, control it with force, even sedition, if we violate God's commands. So overall, people who are Christians should, according to this approach or this theology, should try to bring every aspect of American civil life under God's rule and reign. And that maybe gives them justification to take over the Capitol if they feel like God is being dishonored or his reign is threatened. The other Christian part about this is that it really is undergirded by conservative Christian thinking, literal belief in the Bible, and real apocalyptic visions of societal decline. So they see America morally declining, and so we need to take back America for God to stop that moral decline in order to honor God. So hopefully you get the understanding it's the fusion of being very American, nation oriented, and fusing that with one's Christianity so that God wants us to be oriented to making America in a certain way. This Christian nationalism then is probably, according to Perry and Whitehead, the best predictor towards Americans' racial attitudes. It predicts Trump support even among communities of color. If you're a person of color who also espouses Christian nationalism, then you're more likely to be supportive of Trump. And here you could see how if you adopt Christian nationalist perspectives, you're also more likely to be anti-immigrant. So this light gray bar, think that Christian nationalists tend to believe that immigrants undermine American culture, again, because they're outsiders, they don't belong, that they increase crime, they're dangerous threats, and that we should cut them. We should build a wall. Christian nationalists also are not in favor of Black Lives Matter and are least likely to believe that they face systematic racism. So Christian nationalism that wants to keep America pure, that wants to keep America for native-born Americans, think that immigrants then defile America and immigrants who aren't born in the US don't belong. That then translates to how they treat Asians as, again, the perpetual foreigner, the outsider to be excluded. You could see in this chart that especially whites who are high in Christian and nationalist values are more likely to think the term Chinese virus is okay. It's not racist. They think it's fine to racialize a virus. They think it's fine to stigmatize the Chinese. So again, because Christian nationalists want to keep the nation pure, because they wanted to keep it Christian and Asians aren't necessarily Christian, it's easy for them to want to exclude Asians and to see them as perpetual foreigners. One real strong example of keeping America pure is this incident here, where a woman had Lysol sprayed all over. She was yelling out, "You're the infection, go home. We don't want you here." So in this case, Asians aren't the disease carriers. We are the disease to be disinfected. We are the infection that America needs to get rid of. And this, for me, is just a classic example of Christian nationalism where they feel like America's purity and health are being threatened by dangerous non-white, non-Christian others. So here you can see how Asians are being racialized at this moment. We're not white nor black, but America, race relations is usually on a white-black divide. And voter polls, racial history is often on this white-black binary. When George Floyd was killed, Asian Americans were sort of thrown for a loop because we saw an Asian American police officer holding back the crowds. And we thought, are we complicit with white supremacy or are we in support with Black Lives Matter? When we saw the Asian officer, we couldn't distance ourselves from him. We don't do that. We have a collective group identity. So we saw ourselves in him and we wondered, are we part of this system that oppresses African Americans? And of course, because we're neither white nor black, we're omitted, we often feel invisible, and it's difficult for Asian Americans to figure out where they fit in the American racial dynamics. At the same time, we realize we're not racialized like blacks, but we're actually racialized on a different binary, whether we're insiders to America or outsiders. Again, this is the yellow peril fear, the perpetual foreigner, we're outsiders. Sometimes we are white adjacent. Sometimes we do belong as the model minority. We're crazy rich Asians. But in times of war, like the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, in times of economic downturn, such as when Vincent Chin was killed in Detroit, being mistaken for Japanese by white auto workers who blamed Japan for their layoffs. And in times of pandemic like now, we're cast out as perpetual foreigners. This stereotype, I think, is much more powerful at the moment, much more insidious, much more pervasive, and much more deadly. No one's pushing and killing our elders because they're so smart. They're pushing and killing us because they don't think we belong, that we're invading their neighborhoods, that because we have different accents or because we look different, we could be mistreated as subhuman. Our women, Asian American women, are hypersexualized, treated especially as objects, and therefore can be shot at. So I would argue this perpetual foreigner stereotype, which is reinforced by Christian nationalism, keeps us on the outside. And that's how Asians are racialized, different from Blacks, but again, part of the overall subjugation by the system of white supremacy. So I see ourselves at Stop API Hate in partnership with Black Lives Matter. We're fighting different manifestations of white supremacy, but together we're trying to dismantle this system that creates binaries and divides among people. As I said, the political rhetoric last year exacerbated this issue. The Christian nationalism, the political rhetoric exacerbated the perpetual foreigner, yellow peril fear, and the term Chinese virus really did create the association that the virus was Chinese and Chinese people had the virus. Media representations then went viral. The term Chinese virus went viral, and that virality went to hate speech. And hate speech led to hate violence. Here you see an Instagram post of University of Albany students partying to the coronavirus by drinking Corona beer with pictures of Chinese people in masks, and others had Chinese people with their eyes X'd out. So students were celebrating the deaths of Chinese people with coronavirus. This is a photo of a Chinese person eating a bat, which people said was the source of the disease. So we have the pandemic. It's just a biological phenomenon, but it gets racialized through that yellow peril fear, through the Christian nationalism, through the political rhetoric. And now it's been so normalized that we see day after day now the incidents of hate and violence perpetrated against our elders. The impact of this racism has been devastating. Asian Americans have the worst mental health of any racial group in the US now. Those who experience racism have heightened rates of depression, anxiety, stress, and somatic symptoms. They are experiencing racial trauma. This is how bad it is. We asked Stop AAPI Hate respondents, what's their greatest stressor during the pandemic? What's causing them anxiety? What's causing them fear? The number one stressor is racism. Asian Americans are more concerned about other Americans than they are about the pandemic that has killed 5 or 500,000 people. Does that make sense to you? We're more afraid of other Americans and their racism than we're concerned about a deadly pandemic that has killed 500,000 people. That's how serious this racism is. That's how pervasive it is. That's how scary it is for our community. Because of racism, Asian Americans are the second highest unemployment, face the second highest unemployment rate after Blacks in America. People were avoiding Asian businesses, and as a result, our Asian businesses had to close earlier and lay off people. And as we said, history repeats itself, just like the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had the second Chinese Exclusion Act this past year. The administration banned Chinese scientists and researchers. They suspended migration visas so we couldn't reunify families. He cut refugee resettlement. They cut H-1B visas. And so all these measures exclude us again. The ban on WeChat cut off Chinese freedom of speech and freedom of religion as we worship over WeChat. So racism has had severe impacts, creating a state of fear and really concrete impacts on our mental health, our economy, and whether we can actually live here and bring families here. So this is a real time of siege and threat to the Asian American community. And I think, when people are faced with threats, they go into fight or flight mode. And people see Asians as threats, so they're fighting us, they're attacking us, or they go into flight mode, they're shunning us. And in the same way, Asians are feeling threatened by racism, and we can go into fight or flight mode too. Asians are arming themselves. I've heard parents talk about giving their kids mace to fight back. Asians are fleeing. We're telling our elders to stay home. We're not sending our kids back to school. We're the racial group least likely to send our kids back to school because we're afraid of the pandemic and the racism they may experience. So we're threatened and we can go into fight or flight mode, but there's one other way you can respond, and that's by going into flock mode. And despite my anger over the racism, despite my sadness over seeing how American society can produce individuals that feel free to cough on old people, I'm at least heartened and supported by seeing Asian Americans flock together and come together and to stand up against racism. Asian youth are flocking. In the Bay Area, we had rallies by middle school people. And last year we put a call out, and within a week, we had 100 high school students come together. They surveyed 1,000 fellow Asian American youth, and they came out with a policy report. The recommendations of that policy report for ethnic studies is now being proposed as legislation by Representative Grace Meng this week. So our youth have organized and they're being heard by Congress to address ethnic studies. We're flocking together to grieve together and to gain solace, and we're flocking together for strength and support. So in the Bay Area, I've seen hundreds of people sign up to escort elders in our neighborhoods. I've seen thousands of people this past week join rallies across the nation. And I think by flocking together, we've really amplified our voice, so that today, President Biden just issued another executive order calling for an end to racism and putting government resources behind this battle. At the same time, the Attorney General's office has issued some policy changes, and at all levels of government, at least in our state in California, we're putting major funding towards fighting racism. And it's because we flocked together, caught attention to it, and amplified our voice. When the government and mainstream media weren't paying attention, we've used social media really well. I'm proud to say BTS just supported Stop API Hate in a tweet yesterday, and it became, I don't know, last night, it was the #3 trending tweet with over 1 million likes. So this is our alternative platform to get the message out that we're not going to take the racism. So to conclude, I talked about how Asian Americans, because of Christian nationalism, feel like we don't belong. We're neither white nor black. We're oftentimes not Christian. We're instead the perpetual foreigner, the yellow peril to be kept out. And for Asian Americans, we may not feel accepted at the moment. We're fearful and scared at the moment because people may attack us. As Asian Americans, we may have always felt different. And this, I tell my students, I don't really want to belong to the America as it was. It's based on the stilling of indigenous land. It's based on stilling Black labor. I don't want to belong to America that mass incarcerates, that mass detains, that mass deports, that mass bans people from coming, that mass shoots Asian American women. I don't want to go back to that normal. Instead, I think I want us to reimagine what America can be. And these rallies in Oakland where we come together in multiracial unity give me a little foretaste of what it could be. A place where we don't have that white-black binary, where we don't have that insider-outsider binary, but instead we come together to really honor each other and to respect each other. So I invite you, Purdue community, thank you for flocking with me today. I hope we can continue to flock with the Asian American community in dreaming for an America that we want to belong to. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Russell, for this brief presentation. Now let's open for questions. We have quite some time. If you have questions, please, you can unmute yourself and speak, or you may type it up to the chat area, and Pam, sorry, will read that for you. Okay. Actually, there was a question already while you were talking, especially the last part when you talk about the possible policy considerations. The question is, how can we follow?
I don't know if I have to stay in this or if they're gonna send like a. Because sometimes for these things they like send like a survey at the end that like tracks your attendance.
Sorry, so the question is,
Okay, the question, let me get the question.
I can read it. Will there be a way to follow the progress of that policy as it makes its way through the Congress?
yeah, the ethnic studies one is, Grace Ming has two bills, one a Hate Crimes Act and one a Education Act. And so you could just follow Grace Ming, Congressman Grace Ming. It's probably easier to put the questions in the chat and then we could let Pam or Gong Gong read.
Russell, can I ask a question?
Okay.
I prefer, actually, it's easier if you could curate the, put it in the chat and let them respond. It's faster that way.
The next question is, how many of the 3,800 reports have we confirmed?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Tony, for that question. We haven't been able to confirm. We don't have the capacity to go back and check 3,800 incidents. So we just assume Asian Americans are reporting what they think is racial bias. We're not going to question them and say, oh, there's no proof. So we are assuming that these all are valid indicators of what's happening. Again, we're just a fraction of what's happening. Other random sample surveys show that the extent of this racism is much, much higher than what we're seeing in our incidents. But there has been a Twitter study where they've examined Asian Americans' tweets about their self-reported cases of racism. And they really validate our data. They have the same rates of verbal harassment versus civil rights violations versus shunning and physical assaults. The same type of language is being employed during these incidents. So we think our data is pretty valid in terms of giving a snapshot of what's happening and to show the extent of the hate incidents. We also have been doing checking accounts in the news, and that's the third sort of way we're triangulating the data to confirm this is how people are being targeted and how they experience it.
Okay. And our next question is, as an Asian, if this hate crime happens to us, what is the best way? What is the way to protect ourselves?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And that's for our allies too. We need people to be upstanders. You need to intervene and check in on someone who's being harassed or attacked or bullied. I think the first thing everybody should do is make sure we're safe, right? To get away from the situation and make sure you're physically safe. As we've seen, a lot of the violence occurs when first hate speech is used, and then people get angrier and then they attack us. So you just need to avoid those situations. I think going into flight mode makes total sense, right? It's not good to fight back. I don't agree with like, oh, you should whip out a camera to document. You should just get out of that situation and just avoid people who are dangerous, right? If you can engage with the perpetrator, then you could set clear boundaries saying that type of racist language isn't appropriate. We don't talk to people like that here. And that's what upstanders do. You create those clear boundaries. You need to really attend to your emotional state too, because again, we are being traumatized. And if you let that incident stew, it's going to harm you. This is actually another finding, is that our respondents are getting angrier over time. They don't get better. The more they think about what happened to them, the more they're angry that why are people treating us so badly? It is wrong, right? And so unless you deal with that anger in positive ways, it's just going to chew you up. And so you got to take that anger and lead it to positive action and desire for change. So I would say, first of all, make yourself safe. Secondly, report. Again, if we didn't have all the reports, if we didn't create that collective voice, we wouldn't have been heard by the president, who now has to address this national issue. Asian Americans have made this a national issue. It's not an Asian American issue. It's other people's problems with racism. It's other people's problems with violence. And so it makes sense for government to deal with it and to address it. People are dying over it. So I think the media attention, the government attention we're receiving now is due. So again, for Asian Americans, get out of the situation, fight the racism, and then keep on flocking. So if you want to fight the racism, support the community, go out and help the elders, repatronize Asian businesses who are trying to recover, donate your money, and vote for people who support racial justice.
Okay, I'll read a question for you. Here, I just saw that one is moved down. Okay, one that I noticed, but okay, here. How would you recommend approaching a non-person of color, I think it means white Christian individual, who would attempt to refute the connection between Christian nationalism and racism?
I mean, you could show them the data and the science about the linkage between Christian nationalist views and people's racial attitudes. And if they don't believe the science or the data, then that's sort of the big question for a lot of people who are facing, who are engaged in conspiracy theories, right? So you can't really argue with them through the mind or with data. I think what you can do is try to reach them through the heart. And you tell them your own personal experiences. You tell them your stories of grieving and pain. You tell them maybe how the church has excluded people of color. And if they don't listen to your data and stats, maybe they'll listen to your story. And you can also ask them, again, I heard in studies when people were trying to campaign last year and trying to cross political sides, the way they could actually hear each other is by being empathetic and listening to each other, really. And if we could first hear other people and their concerns and their fears, then maybe they're open to hearing our concerns and our fears. And then once we touch and connect at the human level, then maybe we could connect at the mind level too, about how these aren't just individuals who are facing racism, but these are large groups facing systemic, institutionalized mistreatment. But it's a hard thing to try to, I don't know, this issue of convincing others is really difficult. And we need to use different narrative approaches and different ways of being empathetic to connect with people.
So next question is, do you notice any regional variation in the kinds of violence and harassment that are being reported? Midwest, Northeast?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do get obviously more reports where we have concentrations of Asian Americans. We get more violence from Asian Americans who live in low income areas where there is more violence, right? Like where I live in Oakland, everybody is a victim of violence because it's just a dangerous neighborhood. It's not like Asian Americans are being targeted. It's just that there's a lot of violence here. And now, because of the media attention, people are more focused on the violence that Asian Americans experience as compared to other groups. What I sort of observe anecdotally, and we're going to do a heat map across the United States showing, okay, here are the high levels of racism, and try to map it to Christian nationalism. Like, are areas with higher Christian nationalism, people espousing it, do they have higher rates of hate incidents? That's what we're trying to map. I've noticed anecdotally that New York and San Francisco have the highest rates. It's because we're urban dense centers where people take public transit a lot. And that's where people are in close contact and interact during the pandemic. And I think that close contact and interaction leads to more violence and harassment than if you're in a more rural suburban place where you're spread out. So I don't think it's necessarily like ignorant people. It's actually crowded conditions actually spur more violence and animosity.
Okay, next question again is about Christian nationalism and racism. But let me preface that many Asian Americans are Christian, and you yourself as Christian, fourth generation Christian. And actually, Christianity is the largest religion among Asian Americans. The Pew Research Center has a survey done in 2012 that found that overall 40% or more are Christian and less than 20% are Buddhist, then 10% Hindu, 4% Muslim. But there is the stereotype that Asians or Asian Americans cannot be Christian. Now here's the question that someone raised, that given that this conversation is centered on Christian nationalism, what is the role or responsibility of Asian American Christians in resisting Christian nationalism?
Oh, thank you for inviting me to preach at this moment. I think Christians, I think Asian American Christians are in a unique position to prophetically call out the church because we're on the outside, right? And because we're not part of the Christian nationalists, a lot of us aren't. We can actually on the outside see how broken that type of thinking is, and could challenge the church to change. And I think that's when I speak to churches, I tell them maintain your foreignness, because if you become on the inside, then you become like a Christian nationalist, right? The more you adopt the empire's thinking, the more you believe that we should mistreat foreigners, the more you believe we think it's okay to separate families at the border. So Asian American Christians having that outsider perspective need to use their outsider perspective to be prophetic and to challenge the church, if the church is willing to hear us. I think some Asians are Christian nationalists too, and that's why they support Trump, right? They think America should be a Christian nation and reclaim the heritage that it had. They believe it should have follow the biblical principles, especially Old Testament views, and that's that's their approach to following Christianity. I think that's what they get taught a lot, and I think we need to keep on challenging that too among our Asian American Christian church community. I'm part of this group called the Asian American Christian Collaborative that held 12 to 14 vigils this past Sunday, and they're really trying to challenge the Christian nationalism within the broader church and really hold it to account. So I think it is our particular responsibility of being insiders to the church that we need to call out the church for its issues.
I think this is also a related follow-up to that question. Do you have insight on how have non-Asian, non-Christian communities, such as Jewish communities and Muslim communities, responded to anti-Asian violence? Because these demographic groups are also victimized by Christian nationalists. So
Right.
as well.
I think in general, yeah, again, you have the 40% who are Christian nationalists, and maybe just a portion of those 40% are really, really racist. So I think most Americans are against racism. Most people decry the violence that they're seeing against Asian Americans. So I think we really do have strong allyship and support from the great majority of Americans. I don't think anybody thinks that elderly should be pushed or shoved. So I think it's a matter of us, again, coming up with creative solutions to create community safety preventative measures so that we don't see so much violence in low-income areas. We invest in long-term solutions to fight racism, like ethnic studies and expanded civil rights protections. And we worked with other allies to address the racism that we're all commonly experiencing. This is what I tell Asian Americans: hurt people hurt others, and abused people abuse others. As we're experiencing racism now, we can become racist towards others. Racist people create other racists. And we need to really experience what we're feeling and not dismiss it, but really, if we don't, then we'll just become racist ourselves, right? We'll just repeat the problem. We repeat the cycle of violence. And for we Asian Americans, we need to grieve over what's happening, because this is a teachable moment. This is what we tell our families. It's wrong to experience racism, and if we don't deal with it, we're going to perpetrate it against others. So we need to heal. We need to use this moment as a teaching moment to build racial empathy. As we hurt over being mistreated as outsiders, then we also hurt for others when others are seen as dangerous threats, when others are profiled for being enemies or criminals. And so I think in terms of allyship and in terms of working with other communities of color, this is for Asian Americans our teachable moment for our families. Grieve and fight the racism, feel the hurt, and then develop empathy for others who are similarly hurt, because that's the way we heal each other and become healed people, become healers then. And then we could lead to racial justice.
Okay. There is a question, actually, what you just said has pretty much answered the question, but I still want to read part of it as it shows the complexity or the complex feeling that Asian Americans feel. Here, the question began with, I do wonder what Asian Americans can do on a more systematic level to protect ourselves, considering that the police institution and the Congress and local governments have repeatedly failed to protect us. Both the right and the left have also done little, but essentially perpetuate these issues. With the right being racist in its core, and the left, Biden included, primarily performing lip service while still claiming that China or the DPRK is dangerous and whatnot. Especially for communities that are underfunded or living in poverty, what can be done?
Yeah, good big question, right? Big picture question. For me, at least in terms of racism, if we want to get at the roots of racism and the particular anti-Asian racism we're seeing now, for me, the primary sources are that perpetual foreigner stereotype that Christian nationalism reinforces, that we're excluded as outsiders. And we have to change that narrative of insider outsider, right? And so that takes culture makers, that takes people who reshape this sense of American belonging. So the more we can normalize seeing Asian American characters in media, the more we could have Asian Americans at the decision-making table in government, I think the more we can actually challenge that notion that we're outsiders. The second source of racism that we need to challenge is US-China relations, right? That as there's a Cold War between the two countries, as the US vilifies China and makes it the enemy, then what happens is that Chinese people in the US become the enemy. So American foreign policy in Asia becomes Asian American domestic racial policy. It translates that way. And so we need to think of better ways of engaging in foreign relations where we are able to hold governments accountable, but distinguish the government policies from the people, right? And our friendship and love for the people. So I think those are the two primary drivers of racism. It's American foreign policy and American sense of national belonging. So that takes a long-term narrative change. That's why we're promoting ethnic studies to get people to think differently. That's why we're working. Actually, so we're getting a lot of corporate support. And so I just met with Disney. I was thinking, would it make more change by working with Disney to change how they portray their characters, how they tell their stories? Or does it make more change by working with President Biden and the White House, I don't know, initiative on Asian Americans? What constitutes more change? I think we have to work on all levels, both being culture changers and policy changers, being educators. So I think everybody, whatever position they're in, can make change by using whatever institutional platform you have, whether it's in education, whether it's in, I'm working with a lot of tech companies. They've been really powerful in collecting the data and telling the data story to make a difference. So again, I think wherever Purdue students go out and make a living, they can make a change there, whether it's in the policy world or the cultural world, whether it's in science and industry, or whether it's in the classroom. We all have our role to play. And then given where we are, we could also make institutional change at those locations.
So you mentioned the importance of interrogating the empathy, right, that you mentioned among Asian American communities at this time. We have a question: what is the best way for non-API BIPOC communities for us to be allies to the Asian communities, especially Black individuals?
Well, thanks for asking. The fact that you're asking, I think, is really good allyship, right? It just shows your concern and support of your Asian American friends. And keep on asking that and ask them that. It's like, how can I support you at this moment? I know it must be hard. And even if Asian Americans don't respond right away, just the fact that you're asking and checking in, I think for me, is a sign of empathy. I've really appreciated when people just texted me or called me or wrote to me and asked about how I'm doing. And I'm finding now during the pandemic, more people are doing that, where we're checking in on each other. Secondly, I think, again, be upstanders. And so if you see instances where Asians are harassed, attend to the individual and make sure they're safe and report. I think Asian Americans may have different communication styles. So again, create space so that other people could always be heard and seen. That's why, like Purdue just came out with its official statement denouncing the racism. Those kind of statements actually are helpful. I used to like poo-poo them, but I saw how much the president's words mattered, how much he created a culture of hate that normalized hate. And now we need to normalize love and respect now. We need official statements that say this racism is wrong and we're going to fight against it. That helps Asian Americans feel seen and heard, right? That's how you are allies. When you have these official statements, so wherever you are, whether you're in a church or in a school club or whether you're in a corporate setting, have an official statement so that Asians feel seen and heard, and that's allyship. So your words matter, your concern matters, and I don't know, we have different love languages. They say there's 5 different love languages, like touch, affirmation, gifts. There's other Asian love languages, and ours is food. So feed an Asian and you'll show your love and support for them. Buy boba that supports the business, and then show your concern by making us fat, basically. That's what our parents do.
Okay, here's a question about Asian American studies or ethnic studies. You are in California, but we are east of California. And ethnic studies is not on the radar of our Midwest state. What do you suggest for localized efforts that extend beyond our university. We have no Asian legislators in our Indiana Congress. Oh, yeah. So
Yeah, that's a difficult one, right? When you are a small minority. Actually, again, we really have to leverage this moment when people are racially aware. We have to leverage the Black Lives Matter movement too, and build on that and learn from them. And so even when you're have a minority status and you may not get huge ethnic studies programs, you could fight for individual classes. You could have students create their own self-taught class just to start it, just to get a foot in the door. And then you need to keep on demanding it and keep on having students sign up for it. So it's sort of the constant battle when it's not institutionalized like it is in California. So if you really want it, you got to do it yourself. We actually asked the government to track racism. Government said in California it didn't have the capacity, so we had to create our own website and tracking center. And so it's grown. And I think sometimes you have to take matters in your own hand when government isn't responsive, and that's why you have ARC, and that's why you have student organizations. But then maybe the student organizations can get together and really demand from the institution some concessions. So I think different schools have different amounts of money, different schools have different missions. And so you just have to align ethnic studies with the overall mission for the school. And that then it could be a win-win for both the school administration and the students. I think that's one way to do it. You could also work with alumni. Just to give you a hint, San Francisco State, we have 60 classes in Asian American studies. We have over 3,000 students taking our classes. We're so specific. I teach a class on Asian Americans and environmental justice. We have classes on Filipino American literature. That's how developed the field really is out here. So I think it might be different in the Midwest. Hi, Ryan. Good job.
Question. What advice do you have for organizers who want to create multiracial coalitions to fight against white supremacy, but are finding it difficult to bring groups together due to different lived experiences and cultures?
Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, so you're finding it hard because of cultural differences, right? And it takes time to share cultural understanding. And so you have to have parties willing to agree that we'll spend the time getting to know each other. And then we got to figure out issues that we can work together. And then you have to find common strategies. So I think it is really difficult to build solidarity and allyship over a common issue. Like, let's say you're trying to promote ethnic studies overall, let's say at Purdue as an example. Solidarity in the Western sense, I think is very transactional. It's like, I'll show up for you if you show up for me. But there's so many causes, you can't show up for every group, right? You show up for Black Lives Matter, then you want to show up for environmental justice, then you want to show up for LGBTQ issues, and then you want to show up for animal rights. And so there's lots of issues. And if you're showing up for everybody else, then you have no space to organize your own community, right? And I understand that dilemma. So this transactional, I'll show up for you when you show up for me doesn't really work, I think, in a lot of ways. Instead, at some moments, like if the Asian American community is strong and just trying to organize within the Asian American community, you have to sort of just focus on your immediate task at hand and sort of organize Asian American events and develop Asian American leadership. And maybe at a certain moment, then you could reach across other groups. Already it's difficult. And I just understand that creating your own organization and then building connections is really difficult. So I think that's why you have ARC to help bridge all those groups and to build that unity. I think we have to have a different notion of solidarity where it's not so transactional. I've been thinking about this a lot because I get this question a lot. How do we build solidarity? And I think of it a little bit more like an Asian family, that we just assume relationships. It's not transactional. I just assume I'm going to stay married to my wife. If she fails to meet my needs and I fail to meet her needs, we're not going to divorce. We're just going to stick together. We have a grandma. If our grandma doesn't come through for us, we're still going to take care of our grandma, even if grandma is grouchy. And so I think in our family, we hurt when our fellow member hurts, right? And we're happy when our fellow family member is happy. And that's how I think we need to develop solidarity with other groups. Is when another group is harmed, then we also feel the pain of that group. We assume that we have relationship. We assume that we care about each other, and we work from there. It's a different notion of solidarity. It's a different basis.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, okay, maybe the last question. But this, we talked quite some about what to do, but here still a question about how do we understand? The question is, why did so many of the very dire visible incidents appear in the last couple of months?
Ah,
I guess this is complicated because there's trying have the link between evangelical Christianity and the Christian nationalism and the racism. So this question is a challenge. Why this kind of violence happened more so in the last couple of months?
yeah, that's a great question. That's a great social movements question. So I've been thinking about this one. First of all, you have the violence, and then you have the attention it's receiving, and then you have the movement. And the violence has always been there, I would maintain. Again, if you live in a low-income urban area, we've experienced violence a lot. And during New Year, we experienced more violence. Criminals know Asian elderly are more vulnerable, carry more money, go shopping more. And so we get robbed more. So you have violence, you have heightened violence during Lunar New Year. We have the backdrop of racism, and Stop API Hate has been sounding the alarm, racism, racism, racism. And then we have the violence that's captured in graphic video footage. So together, having the numbers plus the graphic video footage, media puts it together and say, oh, there's hate crimes. And that gets a lot of attention because it's violent. Media picks it up because it's violent, it's cross-racial, and because they have documentation of this has been going on for a while. Plus it's elderly, a vulnerable population. So it makes for a great media story. So that's part of why we're in the media circle for those particular reasons. We have the data for racism, we have graphic footage. If we didn't have any footage, they're not going to tell the story. It's a lot like Black Lives Matter. They had George Floyd being attacked caught on camera. They had the string of incidents beforehand, so it gave context for the George Floyd incident. Now we have context for the Atlanta shootings, right? At the same time, when you have all these sort of media grabbing stories and points, you have Asian Americans amplifying the message at the same time, right? A lot of us, again, I think we're flocking, are using social media to tell the story. And the few Asian Americans we have in elected office, the few Asian American celebrities are also using their platforms. Also, Asian American journalists are the only ones telling the story in the newsroom. So the few Asian Americans in the halls of Congress, the few Asian Americans in Hollywood, the few Asian Americans in the newsrooms have all used their voice and platforms to bring attention to it. And that's what I think has caused the movement. We've been able to galvanize all walks of life in the Asian American community, plus leveraging the moment, leveraging the data, leveraging the graphic footage, and leveraging the Stop API Hate tag to really galvanize the overall community. So that's why BTS just tweeted out Stop API Hate, and it's become one of the trending tweets globally, right? This is the global movement that we're talking about. That's why President Biden issued another executive order today about the issue. This is a big issue, and that's how we've been able to build the movement. We at Stop API, we've been really strategic. We've been trying to change the narrative. We've been trying to document because we knew if we didn't have numbers, we could improve anything happening. We've been using social media because we knew that's how you galvanize young people. So we're being really strategic in how we, at least how we're trying to address the roots of racism over the long haul.
So much, Professor Jiang. I have one last question that perhaps you can address on the national level, and then I can answer from the ARC's perspective in Purdue. Are there any events coming up where we can show solidarity around these issues and put pressure on politicians and community to enact change.
Oh, no, sorry. Last Friday was the day of action, Friday the 26th. So that was a national event. Asian Heritage Month will be the next big moment where I think we could galvanize and organize allies to protest what's happening. So push for those congressional bills to be supported, and then push in Indiana, which you can.
So if you're interested from Purdue and ARC's perspective, if there are people who cannot attend today's event, obviously this recording will be made available. But tomorrow we have a teach-in question and answer led by several Asian American studies faculty members and graduate students. So please attend that as well. Nathan, if you can show the flyer for that, please. So that is one event that you can attend. And also we have counseling and psychological services available every week, a liaison at the ARC to help encourage students to come and get a moment of healing. We also will do a bystander intervention training with several different universities in Indiana and in the Midwest. So, again, all of these events are on the ARC's website. I would be happy to put our link on the chat. But yeah, thank you so much for that question. Back to you, Professor Young.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation and your answers to many of the questions. And I think this is only the beginning, and I hope there will be more in-depth discussions on various occasions. Some questions we don't have time to answer live, but those questions we all need to think further and then gather together and talk. Again, thank you, Russell Jones. I really appreciate this. And thank you everyone for participating in this talk. Hope to see you again soon.